The event that started it all, the Brown v. Board of Education ruling in 1954, which declared that state laws that allowed for segregated schools between black and white students were unconstitutional. Of course, there were both critics and praisers who argued over the Supreme Court ruling, but nonetheless the ruling stood. Although segregation was now illegal, it took some schools in the Deep South many years to desegregate, and there was violence to go along with it. Most importantly, the ruling was a monumental energizer in the African American civil rights movement. What's great about this picture is it details everything the movement fought for and everyone who fought for it. Black and white, men and women, all walking hand in hand for the same cause. You can see they want equal rights on every issue, from education in schools to at the voting booth to economic rights, protesting for jobs, and better access to loans for housing. And one of the most telling parts of the picture is the way they are dressed and seem to be acting. They don't look outraged, they look calm, cool, and collected, dressed as if they're going to Sunday church. No weapons and no violence. The man responsible for advocating for this type of nonviolent protest in the civil rights movement is Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., probably the most famous man in the civil rights movement. He was a Protestant pastor who believed in the nonviolent ways of Gandhi, and he was their leader. You can see in this picture in Washington, D.C., him waving to thousands of people after giving his famous I Have a Dream speech. He's still quite popular after his assassination being referenced in pop culture, from the rappers Kendrick Lamar and Common to the band U2 to the TV and drama Mad Men. The civil rights movement was extremely successful. African Americans now have equal rights in voting, and there's no segregation in schools. There's also laws against discrimination against other races when hiring for jobs. I think the payoff of the civil rights movement's successes are most apparent years later. We had African Americans in the House and Senate, the Supreme Court, the presidential office. There have been African American CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. I believe there are no significant failures in the civil rights movement. There are still some hints of racism in the Deep South, and the incarceration rate of young African American men is significantly higher than any other group of people. But these things take time to chip away, generations to chip away at, and eventually people won't see color anymore. The protests against Vietnam War, which started in 1964, launched off the back end of the civil rights movement. Protesters were mostly made up of students, mothers, soldiers, and yes, the infamous hippies of the 60s and 70s. Most had different reasons for protesting. In a time of great activism in young people, students didn't want to be drafted in the war. Mothers didn't want to lose their sons. Soldiers didn't want to die in war, especially one they may have felt was a meaningless fight. And hippies protested for peace and to be against the man or anti-establishment. All wanted the war to end. An important part of the Vietnam War protests were indeed the supporters of Vietnam. The people who backed LBJ included conservatives, soldiers, Catholics, older men, and generally anyone who would be considered anti-communist. Catholics backed the Vietnam War because southern Vietnam was seen as one of the last Catholic democracies in that part of Asia. With phrases like "kill a commie for Christ" and the bearing of crosses at supporter rallies, it was evident that religion played a role in some people's support of the war. Older men and conservatives generally support the War for a Peace Through Strength initiative. These men had fought in the World War I and World War II and possibly couldn't understand why a man wouldn't want to serve their country, even though Vietnam turned out to be a very different war than those preceding it. The protesters were also incredibly famous for having the backing of famous musicians and using their own songs to rally against the war. Some of the most famous artists were Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, and Jimi Hendrix. These famous artists were extremely vital and important to the movement because they gave the protesters someone iconic to rally around when the times were hard. Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan were even known to go to Vietnam and tour the camps where the soldiers were to uplift spirits. The songs played were overwhelmingly anti-establishment and made references to the Bible with Judas and made particularly pointed attacks at Lyndon B. Johnson. I feel the Vietnam War protests had its successes, but it was mainly composed of failures. It ruined a lot of LBJ's legacy, which I'm sure was a win to the protesters. It also brought great attention to the war. The protesters were covered in the media and addressed by politicians. The songs and artists have gone down in the history books. Ultimately, though, I feel the protesters failed at their goal for peace. They eventually got peace, but I feel it wasn't mainly due to them. The war went on for 10 plus years, and the U.S. got out of it because it was costing too many resources and was draining the country's spirit. The feminist movement, also piggybacking off of the end of the civil rights movement, was vastly important to the continued progress of equality between men and women. These feminist women wanted equal rights and protection against discrimination in the workplace, and not only that, they looked to change the complete societal perception of women in regards to sexuality, roles in marriage and the household, economic rights, and appropriate clothing and body image. Some more radical feminists looked to completely overthrow the patriarchy that they felt would continue to oppress them, and these more radical feminists also looked for equal rights everywhere. They wanted women to be draft eligible and for women to be able to fight on the front lines just like men. Some notable figures in this new movement of feminism were Betty Friedman, the author of The Feminine Mystique. She alleged that a woman's talent was wasted at home when she became a glorified babysitter. She also argued that the very popular ideal of a nuclear family at the time was degrading to women. Gloria Steinem was another popular figure. She was a freelance journalist who went undercover as a Playboy bunny waitress and exposed what she described as male chauvinism. The feminist movement never really had a singular leader because the women who composed the movement were so diverse and had so many different goals. Radical and conservatives, old and young, black and white. The movement was all-encompassing. This gave them the power to make changes that they all sought in common with each other. Of all the groups protesting, from African Americans for civil rights to Vietnam protesters wanted to end the war to feminists looking for equal rights, African American women had it the hardest. It was described as double jeopardy to be African American and a woman. Faced with racism and sexism, they overcame. Many groups were formed to support this cause, such as the African Women's Action for Revolutionary Exchange, the Salsa Soul Sisters, with Aware being the main group. They gave speeches at civil rights conferences, such as the speech entitled Black Women and Black Liberation, Fighting Oppression and Building Unity, given at the Malcolm X Conference. Overall, the feminist movement was largely successful. They are now able to take out something as simple as a loan on their own. A lot of women have had very successful and fulfilling careers and are not doomed to be a housewife. We have women as Supreme Court justices, senators, and CEOs. They have no real boundaries anymore, and we may have women as president as soon as 2016 with the probable running of Hillary Clinton. The only thing left to overcome is what some women describe as a glass ceiling in the workforce. These will be overcome as we see more and more that women are equal to men in intelligence and ability in the workforce.